The evening had just begun at the private club, and the hallway was already filled with the soft clinking of glasses and distant conversations. The place was known for its expensive dinners, quiet luxury, and guests who enjoyed being served in the most perfect way possible. Among the staff moving quickly but silently through the dining area was a young woman who had worked there long enough to know every corner of the place. She carried herself with calm patience, even on the busiest days. And she always made sure every table looked perfect before the guests arrived. She wasn't someone people noticed right away. She wore the same simple uniform every day, tied her hair back so it wouldn't fall on her face, and kept her steps light so she wouldn't disturb anyone. To most people, she was just another waitress doing her job. But inside her, there was a whole world she never showed. She had learned long ago that life didn't always give you space to talk about your dreams. Sometimes you had to fold them up and place them somewhere deep, hoping that one day you might have a chance to open them again. In the main hall of the club stood a grand piano. It shone under the warm lights like a piece of art, polished every morning by the cleaning staff until it looked untouched. Most evenings, a professional pianist sat there playing soft music for the guests. But on days when the piano was quiet, the place felt empty in a strange way, as if something was missing from the air. When she walked past it, she always slowed her steps for just a moment. Her eyes would fall on the piano keys, and for a second, she would forget she was carrying a tray or rushing to serve a table. She had grown up in a small home where music was a luxury. She didn't have a real piano. She learned on a keyboard someone else had thrown away because a few keys didn't work. She didn't take classes or study under any teacher. She taught herself by listening, copying, and practicing whenever she had time. She used to sit on the floor with the keyboard on her lap, tapping the keys as if the world outside didn't exist. Music was her escape from everything she didn't understand or couldn't control. But life changed quickly. Bills came in. Her family needed help. She had to work, and the keyboard didn't travel with her. It stayed behind, forgotten in the corner of the room where dust slowly gathered on it. Now, working long shifts at the club, she almost never touched any instrument. The piano in the hall was like a reminder of something she had lost, something she still cared for but didn't dare to reach toward. She didn't want anyone to laugh or stare at her. She didn't want to make mistakes in front of people who already had strong ideas about who should touch an expensive instrument and who shouldn't. That night, the club was hosting a charity dinner for a group of important guests. The preparations had started early in the afternoon. Staff rushed from place to place to make sure nothing went wrong. The kitchen buzzed with noise. The dining area filled with fragrant dishes, candles, and soft golden lighting. Everything had to be perfect. The guests who attended these events didn't accept mistakes. She stood near the back counter folding napkins, one after another, making sure each fold was sharp and clean. She looked up when she heard the event manager complaining loudly to one of the other staff members. The manager was always nervous, but tonight he seemed extra frustrated. She heard him say that the pianist had canceled at the last minute due to an emergency. He was upset because he had tried calling several replacements, but none were available on such short notice. "We can't run a charity dinner without music," he said, pacing back and forth as if the floor was on fire. "The guests expect a certain atmosphere. Silence will ruin everything." The other staff members tried to calm him, but his frustration only grew. She watched quietly, understanding the problem but knowing there was nothing she could do. Her heart beat a little faster whenever the piano was mentioned, but she immediately pushed the feeling down. That part of her life was over, she reminded herself. As the evening progressed and the guests began arriving, she moved through the hall, carrying trays of sparkling water and appetizers. She kept her eyes focused on her tasks, though she felt something tug at her whenever she passed by the grand piano. Someone had placed a small reserved for performer card on the top, but there was no performer to be seen. The piano sat untouched, its lid open, as if waiting for someone who would never come at one point. While she was clearing empty glasses from a table, she heard two guests talking nearby. They were dressed in expensive clothes and spoke in calm, polished voices. One of them said, "It's strange. I thought they always had music here during these events." The other replied, "Maybe something happened, but this feels different without it." She kept her eyes down and didn't say a word, though she felt a small ache inside her chest. She knew exactly what they meant. The room felt incomplete, as if the air was missing its rhythm. When the guests moved toward the buffet table, she collected the last glass and walked toward the back. On the way, she passed the piano again. This time, she paused for only a second longer than usual. The lights above the instrument made the keys shine like they were calling for a touch. She took a quiet breath and reached out and placed a fingertip on a single key. Just one note. A soft, clean sound floated into the room. It was small, almost hidden under the noise of conversation, but still bright enough that it reached the ears of a few people standing nearby. She pulled her hand back quickly, surprised by her own action. Her cheeks warmed with sudden embarrassment. A guest who had seen her smiled with curiosity. "Do you know how to play?" he asked in a friendly tone, though she immediately shook her head. "No, sir," she said softly, hoping the moment would pass. But another guest overheard and stepped closer. Interested by the small sound he had heard? "It didn't sound like someone who doesn't know," he said lightly. That one note was perfect. She felt her face heat up even more. She tried to walk away, but the first guest spoke again, this time with a small laugh. "Come on, play something. Just a little sound. We won't judge." The event manager suddenly appeared behind them, looking even more stressed than before. No, he said quickly. "We can't have staff touching the piano. It's for professionals only." The guests exchanged amused looks. "Well," one of them said, "since you don't have a professional tonight, maybe you should let her try." One note sounded better than silence. The manager hesitated, torn between not wanting to upset the guests and not wanting to risk embarrassment. "It's not appropriate," he said, though his voice carried more uncertainty now. One of the guests, clearly someone with influence, rested his hand on the back of a chair and looked directly at the manager. "Let her try," he said firmly. "We have nothing to lose." The room fell into a small pocket of silence. The manager swallowed and finally sighed. "Fine, but just a sound check." "Nothing more?" She stood frozen in place. She wanted to refuse, to shake her head, to disappear into the kitchen and hide. She had not played in years, not even privately. Her hands felt stiff, her heart thumping loudly in her chest. She stepped slowly toward the piano, unsure if her legs would even hold her. She sat down carefully on the bench, wiping her palms on her apron. The wooden surface felt cold under her fingers. She took a breath so small, she wasn't even sure it entered her lungs. She looked at the crowd. They weren't staring in a harsh way, but instead with quiet curiosity. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys. She didn't know what to play. She didn't know if she still remembered anything. She felt a deep fear that her hands would tremble or her mind would go blank. But she pressed one key, then another. A tiny melody floated out simple, almost too small for the room. But the sound was clean and gentle, as if shaped by someone who understood music in a quiet, personal way. The room slowly softened around her. The noise grew lighter. A few conversations paused. People turned their heads just slightly. Wondering where the music was coming from, she played a few more notes, her fingers moving carefully, as if trying to remember old steps she had once known well. She didn't dare look at anyone. She didn't dare think about where she was. She only knew that for the first time in years, she was touching music again. She didn't play long, just enough to feel something spark back to life inside her. She felt a small tremble in her fingertips. Not from fear this time, but from a memory waking up. When she stopped, the room returned to its normal noise. But several guests kept looking at her, surprised. They had not expected a waitress in a simple uniform to sit at a grand piano and create a delicate sound that made the room pause for a moment. The manager, still unsure how to react, cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said in a quick, awkward voice. "That's enough for now. You may return to your duties." She stood up quietly, nodded, and walked away, her heart still beating too fast. She didn't know what she had just done. She didn't know why she had pressed that first note. She only knew she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Something warm, something familiar. It was only one small moment. But sometimes a small moment is enough to open a door that has been closed for years. and she had no idea that this small moment was only the beginning of something far bigger than she could imagine. The moment she touched the piano. Earlier, kept replaying in her mind long after she walked away from it. She tried to focus on serving dishes, collecting empty plates, and moving through the tables without drawing attention. But each time she passed the piano again, she felt a tiny pull, like an invisible string connecting her to something she had forgotten she loved. She kept her eyes down, pretending she didn't notice anything unusual, yet her heart felt strangely awake, beating with a quiet excitement she didn't fully understand. The hall grew louder as more guests arrived. Conversations overlapped, glasses clinked softly, and the warm lights reflected off the polished tables, making everything seem elegant and untouchable. People laughed, talked about business, travel, new investments, and all the things she rarely thought about. She drifted between the tables like she always did, listening without truly hearing, smiling politely whenever someone addressed her. But beneath that calm surface, her thoughts kept returning to the feel of the piano key under her finger. She couldn't remember the last time she had played anything in front of another person. Even when she still had her old keyboard, she played only when she was alone. The idea of performing, even as a joke, even for just a few seconds, used to frighten her. She never thought she would find herself sitting in front of a grand piano in a room filled with elite guests who had every reason to judge her. Yet she had done it. Not perfectly, not confidently, but enough to make something inside her shift. She tried to push the feeling to the back of her mind. She told herself there was no point thinking about music anymore. Life didn't wait for people who wanted to dream. Life needed rent money, bills paid, long shifts, and quiet acceptance of whatever happened each day. She had learned that early. So why now, out of all times, did her heart feel like someone had nudged it awake? She was carrying a tray of desserts when she heard someone mention her again. A group of guests were standing near the piano, holding small glasses of sparkling drinks, speaking softly but clearly enough that she could hear. "That girl who touched the piano," one of them said. "She played a few notes, didn't she?" "Yes," another replied. "It sounded surprising for someone who works here." "Maybe she practiced at home," someone else guessed. She kept walking, pretending she wasn't listening, though her ears burned. She didn't like being talked about. She didn't want attention. She worked hard to blend into the background, not stand in the center of it. She hoped they would forget the moment and move on. When she reached the back counter, she found the event manager again, speaking in quick, worried sentences to the assistant chef. "I can't believe the pianist canceled," he said, rubbing his forehead. "Music sets the tone. Without it, this whole dinner feels unfinished." "You could call someone else," the chef suggested. "I already tried. No one is free." And now the guests are starting to notice. They seemed interested in the staff girl, the chef said with a small shrug. The manager's eyes widened. "Don't even mention that. She played 1 or 2 notes. That's not enough for an event like this. What if she embarrasses herself? Or worse, embarrasses us?" She stood quietly nearby, pretending to arrange the dessert plates, though she heard every word. A mix of relief and sadness passed through her. Part of her wished they would forget the whole thing. Another part, the part she didn't want to admit even existed, felt a sting when the manager dismissed her so quickly. She wasn't a professional, she knew that. She wasn't trained. She wasn't perfect. But music had once been something she understood, something she felt deeply. It hurt, in a small way, to hear someone speak as if she had no right to the instrument. She turned away before anyone noticed her expression and went back to work. The evening grew busier. More dishes were served, more drinks poured, and the sound of conversations filled every corner. But the absence of music was becoming clearer. The room felt hollow under the noise, as if something invisible but important was missing. Guests kept glancing at the piano, expecting someone to appear and start playing at one point. A well-dressed woman approached her while she was refilling glasses. The woman's expression was kind but curious. "Excuse me," she said gently. "Were you the one who touched the piano earlier?" She froze for a brief second, then nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm sorry if—" "Oh no," the woman interrupted. "Don't apologize. That sound was lovely. Do you play? She hesitated, unsure how to answer. I used to. A little. The woman smiled in a way that made her feel less nervous. Well, you have a gift. Even one small note can say a lot when it comes from someone who cares about the instrument. She didn't know how to reply, so she simply thanked her and continued with her work. But the woman's words stayed with her like a small, gentle echo. Later in the evening, as she walked through the hall carrying a tray, she noticed that a few more guests had gathered near the piano. They weren't touching it, only talking about it. One of them pointed to the keys and said something she couldn't fully hear, but the tone was light, almost excited, as if they were hoping the piano would come alive again. The room was reaching the point in the night where people were relaxed enough to enjoy music, but not tired enough to leave. The timing was perfect for a performance. If there had been a performer, she kept her distance. She didn't want to get pulled into another conversation about the piano. She didn't want anyone asking her to try again. She had already stretched herself when she touched the keys the first time. Doing it a second time felt impossible, but the guests weren't ready to let the moment go. When she was clearing a table near the center of the hall, Nia approached her. Their expressions were polite, not pushy, but she felt a wave of nervousness rise in her chest. "Excuse me?" one of them said with a friendly smile. "We've been talking about that little sound you played earlier. It was beautiful. Do you know any simple tunes? Just something soft?" She shook her head quickly. "I'm sorry, sir." "I shouldn't be. You don't have to perform," the other man reassured her. "We're just curious." The room feels a bit empty without music. Before she could respond, she saw the event manager approaching from the corner of her eye. He looked both annoyed and worried. "What's going on?" he asked sharply. One of the men gestured toward the piano. "We just asked if she could try playing a little something." The manager forced a stiff smile. "We appreciate your interest, but I'm sure she is busy with her duties. We can't have her stop working." "It would only take a minute," the man insisted gently. The manager's smile tightened even more. He didn't want to upset important guests, but he also didn't want to risk a scene. She felt trapped between them. She didn't want the manager to get in trouble, and she didn't want the guests to feel ignored. But the idea of sitting at the piano again terrified her. One of the women who had spoken earlier returned to the conversation. "If she wants to try, let her. She has talent." The manager looked at her with a mixture of exhaustion and caution. "Do you want to?" he asked quietly, though his tone suggested he hoped she would say no. She didn't know what to say. Her heart pounded loudly. Her hands felt strangely warm. She looked at the piano, then at the guests, then at the manager. She felt the weight of everyone's expectation. Even though no one seemed to be pressuring her harshly, the truth was, she did want to touch the piano again. Not to show off, not to impress anyone, but because something inside her had stirred awake, and it wouldn't go back to sleep. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. A guest stepped closer and said softly, "Just a few notes. Nothing more. We're not expecting perfection." That word perfection softened her fear. She had spent her whole life trying to be perfect at work, trying not to make mistakes, trying not to be noticed for the wrong reasons. But music wasn't about perfection for her. It was about feeling. She took a slow breath and nodded slightly. The manager sighed in defeat. The guests smiled with quiet excitement. A small circle of attention slowly formed around the piano. She walked toward it again, her steps small but steady. The room wasn't silent yet, but many people were watching with curiosity. She sat on the bench, folding her hands in her lap for a moment before placing them on the keys. She didn't start playing right away. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her heartbeat. The keys felt familiar but distant, like meeting an old friend after many years. She pressed one key, then another. A soft hum drifted into the air. The sound was simple, gentle, but it carried something warm behind it. People nearby paused mid-conversation. Someone at a distant table looked up. The room slowly shifted. She played a few more notes, letting her fingers remember shapes they hadn't touched in years. She made small mistakes, tiny slips that only she noticed, but she didn't stop. Her hands began to move with more comfort, more trust. The room grew quieter with each passing second, the noise fading like a tide pulling away from the shore. She wasn't performing. She wasn't showing off. She was just playing something small she used to play alone in her room when she was younger, but even that small melody was enough to make the air feel different. She stopped after a short moment. Lifting her hands gently off the keys, the room didn't erupt with applause yet. Instead, it held a soft, stunned silence. And she sat there, unsure what would happen next. She stayed seated at the piano for a brief moment after the last note faded, unsure if she should stand up right away or wait for someone to say something. The silence in the room wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was soft, almost thoughtful, as if everyone needed a second to process what they had just heard. She looked down at her hands, surprised that they had remembered how to move with even a small amount of grace after all these years. The silence broke gently when someone near her let out a quiet breath, the kind that sounded like they had been holding it without realizing. Then a few soft murmurs followed, not loud or dramatic, but enough to let her know people were paying attention. She immediately pushed back her chair, ready to stand and return to her duties before anyone could make a big deal out of it. She didn't want eyes on her. She didn't want trouble with the manager. She didn't want to seem like she was trying to be the center of anything. But before she could step away, one of the guests near the front table spoke up. "Play something else," he said, gently, not as a command. Not as a pushy request, but almost like a hopeful invitation. Her breath caught in her chest. Her first instinct was to shake her head, apologize, and walk back to the kitchen. She wasn't a performer. She didn't have a list of songs ready. She only knew scattered pieces from her past, half-remembered melodies she used to play when she was alone. She didn't trust herself to keep going without freezing up. She glanced toward the event manager. His expression was complicated, a mixture of stress, surprise, and something else she couldn't quite understand. He didn't look angry this time. He didn't even look annoyed. He looked uncertain. The guest spoke again, smiling gently. "Just a few more notes. It really changes the room." Another guest nodded, adding softly, "You don't have to play anything difficult. Your touch is very natural. It makes the atmosphere calm." She swallowed hard. Her palms were beginning to sweat, and her heart thumped loudly enough that she wondered if anyone else could hear it. She wasn't sure why everyone suddenly wanted her to continue. She had only planned to touch a few notes, not fill the room with music. She felt she didn't belong at such an elegant piano in front of people who owned expensive clothes and lived lives she couldn't even imagine, yet she felt something else too, an invisible thread pulling her back toward the keys. A quiet, warm feeling she hadn't felt in a long time. Her fingertips hovered over the keys again. The bench creaked softly under her shifting weight. She didn't know what to play, so she let her hands find a pattern they remembered. A gentle, flowing set of notes she used to play late at night when everyone was asleep. The sound drifted through the air like a small breeze, calm, soft, without any intention of showing off. The room slowly grew quieter again. Conversations faded. People turned their heads. Even those who had been busy talking about business or investments began to lean back in their chairs, their attention caught by something they hadn't expected. She didn't look at anyone while she played. She kept her eyes on the keys, her posture small and careful. But her touch grew steadier. Her hands moved with slightly more confidence as the melody continued. She made small mistakes notes. It came a bit too early or too late, but no one seemed to notice or care. The notes blended into the warm lighting of the hall, filling the empty space that had felt so noticeable earlier. The piano, which had sat untouched for most of the night, now sounded like it belonged again. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys, the room didn't immediately react. It took a few seconds for the last soft echo of the sound to fade. Then, slowly, gently, a few people started clapping. Not loud applause. Not the dramatic kind that echoed through the hall. Just soft, warm appreciation from people who genuinely enjoyed what they heard. She felt her face warm with embarrassment. She stood up quickly, giving a small nod, unsure of what else to do. She didn't want attention. She didn't know how to handle praise not for something like this. The clapping faded as she stepped away from the piano, her heart fluttering in her chest. She hurried back toward the side of the room, ready to hide behind her duties again. But before she reached the corner, a woman gently stopped her. "That was beautiful," the woman said with genuine warmth. "Do you play often?" She shook her head softly. "No, ma'am. Not anymore." "Well, you should," the woman said. "You have a rare kind of softness in your playing. It's not forced. It feels honest." She thanked her quietly and slipped away before the conversation could continue. She headed toward the back area and took a deep breath, steadying herself. She needed a moment to gather her thoughts. The kitchen staff glanced at her curiously when she walked in. One of them lifted an eyebrow. "You're the one playing out there?" She nodded politely, trying not to make a big deal out of it. A younger server looked impressed. "You sounded really good." People were talking about it. The attention made her uncomfortable. She muttered something about needing to get back to work and quickly grabbed a tray to return to the hall. When she stepped out again, the room felt different. It wasn't louder or quieter. It just felt like more people were aware of her presence than before. When she walked by tables, a few guests smiled at her, nodding in gratitude. Some simply watched her with thoughtful expressions. She kept her head down and focused on her tasks, but each time she passed the piano, she felt something tug at her again. It wasn't long before a small group of guests called her over. They were sitting near the window, dressed elegantly, but their faces carried friendly interest rather than any sign of superiority. "Sit for a moment," one of them said softly. "We want to ask you something." She hesitated but obeyed out of politeness, sitting on the edge of an empty chair. "You played beautifully," the woman beside her said. "It wasn't something rehearsed, it felt real." "Thank you," she said quietly. "Do you know many songs?" Another man asked. "Some," she admitted, "but I haven't practiced in years." "You must have learned somewhere," the woman said. She shook her head. "I didn't take classes. I learned by listening." "I practiced on an old keyboard." The guests exchanged looks of surprise. "That's even more impressive," the man said. "Some people practice for years and never sound as natural as you do." She didn't know what to say. Compliments made her uneasy. She felt out of place sitting with them. The conversation stayed gentle, and after a few moments, she excused herself politely and went back to work. But the more she walked through the hall, the more she realized the entire evening was shifting in a way she couldn't fully understand. People who hadn't noticed her at all earlier were now watching her with soft curiosity. The room felt brighter somehow, and she felt something stirring inside. Her a mix of fear, excitement, and confusion. She didn't want to hope for anything. Hope was dangerous, but she couldn't deny that something meaningful had happened. Later in the night, after the main course was served and guests were relaxing with drinks, the event manager approached her. His expression was different now, not annoyed, not frustrated. He looked tired, but also thoughtful. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Her heart dropped. She immediately feared she had done something wrong. "Yes, sir?" she said softly. He looked around, making sure no one was listening, then faced her directly. "You changed the room," he said in a low voice. "I didn't expect that." She didn't know how to respond. He continued, "If you're willing, would you play again before the night ends? Nothing complicated, just something soft." She blinked in surprise. "You want me to?" He nodded slowly. "The guests seem happier. And well, we need music. You're helping." She hesitated. "I don't know if I can keep playing for so long." "You don't have to play non-stop," he said. "Just a few more moments throughout the night." She lowered her gaze, unsure if she should say yes. But the truth was, she wanted to. She nodded. The manager released a breath, relieved. "Good. I'll let the guests know we'll have a little more music soon." She walked away. Feeling her heart beating faster than before, she didn't understand what was happening. She didn't know why people cared so much. She only knew that something in her life, something she had left behind long ago, had opened its eyes again. And as the night continued, she realized the piano was no longer just a silent Instrument in the corner, it had become. The place where her past and present gently touched. The night was not over, and neither was her story. Room was silent in a way that felt almost unreal. It was the kind of silence people usually heard in movies, not in real life. But it was happening right there. Inside that hall, filled with expensive clothing, soft lights, and people who were used to seeing the best of everything. Yet now, they were seeing something they had never expected. They were watching a waitress sit at a grand piano and play like she had been born for that moment. She took a slow breath. Her fingers rested on the keys, still trembling a little, but the tremble didn't stop her. If anything, it made her look more real, more human. She wasn't someone who lived on stages or in music rooms. She was someone who carried trays, wiped tables, and walked home in tired shoes. But the moment she touched the keys again, everything else faded away. She didn't overthink. She didn't plan. She simply let her hands move. The melody that came out was soft at first, like a whisper. It floated through the room so gently that people leaned forward without even realizing it. It wasn't a famous song, and no one recognized it, but that almost made it better. It was her own piece, something she had created long ago. Maybe when life was simpler, or when she still believed she could dream. A soft gasp came from one of the tables near the front. Someone else set down their drink, too moved to take another sip. The hall lights made her small figure glow in a warm shade, and it didn't matter that she wore an apron over her simple uniform. It didn't matter that she had spent the entire day serving others. At that moment, she was the only one who mattered. She kept playing. Her hands moved faster, then slower, then gently again, as if the keys were responding to her thoughts. The song felt like a journey starting in a quiet place, rising into something strong, then falling into softness again. It was emotional without trying to be. It carried warmth, sadness, hope, and strength all at the same time. People who had been chatting loudly earlier now seemed frozen. A couple in the middle row held hands. A young man who had been checking his phone earlier now stared at her with both eyebrows raised. Even the staff who worked with her stood still near the back, their eyes wide and unbelieving. The restaurant owner stood near the side wall, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. No one knew what he was thinking, but even he wasn't immune to the power in the room. He watched her closely, maybe trying to understand how he had missed something so big in someone he saw every day. The song began to shift again. Her fingers moved into a part of the melody that had more depth, something that came from a deeper place inside her. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at her hands. Her eyes were slightly closed, almost like she was remembering something. Maybe she was thinking of the old keyboard she used to practice on. Maybe she was thinking of the nights she played quietly so she wouldn't wake up anyone. Maybe she was thinking of the dreams she had pushed away, because life demanded she work instead. A woman near the front wiped a tear from her eye. A man next to her whispered something, but his voice cracked. The softness of the piano filled the large room with a feeling no one expected from a charity dinner. Then something surprising happened. The waitress shifted into a slightly faster rhythm. Her fingers moved with more confidence, almost like she was finally letting go of whatever fear had held her back. The melody became brighter, almost hopeful. A few people actually smiled, not because they were entertained, but because they felt something. The air changed. It was like everyone had forgotten about the fancy food on their plates or the conversations they planned to have. They were all connected in a very real, very human way. By the sound coming from her hands, someone near the back whispered, "How is she doing that?" Another person answered in a quiet voice, "I don't know, but this is unbelievable." She continued playing, and the emotions kept shifting. The song dipped into sadness again, but the sadness wasn't heavy. It was honest. It was the kind of sadness everyone had felt at some point in their lives. It's the kind that made them remember loss, pain, or missed chances. But then, gently, she brought the song back to a softer, calmer place, like she was guiding everyone through their emotions instead of dragging them down. Her fingers slowed. For a moment, she almost stopped playing completely, letting only a faint echo remain in the hall. The silence in the room became even deeper, so deep that people almost held their breath. Then she continued with a new softness. It was the kind of softness that felt like forgiveness or healing. The kind that felt like a warm hand resting gently on someone's shoulder. People didn't need to know the story behind it. They could feel it. She sat straighter now, her posture stronger, her eyes open just slightly. She looked calm, peaceful, like she belonged right there. Under the soft lights, with everyone watching her, the melody rose again, not too loud. It's not too strong, but enough to lift the energy in the room. It felt like sunrise after a long night. The kind of moment that brought relief. The kind that made people believe things could get better. Her hands moved in a flowing motion. One chord blending into the next, creating a gentle wave of sound. The harmony felt warm and full, spreading across the room like a soft blanket. Even those who didn't understand music could tell the song was special. It was more than talent. It was heart. Near one of the tables, an older man who had hardly reacted to anything all evening found himself smiling. He wasn't someone who smiled often, especially not at events like this. But this was different. This was something that touched a part of him he didn't let many people see. Another person held their hand over their chest, as if trying to steady the emotion they felt. Someone else whispered, "This is beautiful," not caring if anyone heard. The waitress didn't hear any of it. She didn't need to. She wasn't performing for attention or applause. She was playing because the music was inside her, because the moment called for something real, something honest. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself be fully seen. The melody reached a gentle peak, then slowly drifted downward again. Her fingers softened with every note, guiding the song to its last stretch. It felt like the story within the music was coming to a close, and everyone in the room sensed it. Her final notes were delicate, almost like feathers landing on the keys. One last note echoed softly, hanging in the air long after her fingers lifted away. She sat still, completely still. The hall didn't move either. No one clapped yet. It wasn't because they didn't like it. It was because they needed a second to absorb what had happened. Then someone started clapping. Another person joined, and within moments, the hall erupted into loud, emotional applause. People stood up from their seats. A few cheered. Some wiped tears. Others shook their heads in disbelief. It was the kind of reaction only genuine emotion could bring out. The waitress looked shocked. She wasn't expecting any of this. She had played because she felt she had to, because the piano called to her. She had not imagined she would end up receiving a standing ovation from people who'd barely noticed her before. She placed her hands on her lap. She lowered her head slightly, trying to steady her breathing. She looked overwhelmed, like she wasn't sure if this was really happening, but it was happening. And everyone in that room knew. They had witnessed something rare, something real. Someone near the front whispered, "She's not just good. She's something else," another person said. "This might be the best moment of the whole night." The applause kept going, louder than anything the hall had heard in a long time. And as the sound filled the room, the waitress finally lifted her head and saw the crowd standing for her, her eyes filled with emotion. She didn't cry, but the shine in her eyes showed everything she felt. She stood slowly, almost unsure, and gave a small, humble nod. The crowd clapped even louder. It wasn't just appreciation, it was respect. And it was only the beginning of something bigger than she could imagine. The applause finally began to fade. Not because the crowd lost interest, but because people needed to breathe. They needed a moment to understand what they had just experienced. The waitress stood beside the piano, still holding the small towel she used earlier while working, almost as if she had forgotten to let it go. Her cheeks were slightly flushed, her hands still warm from playing. Her heart felt like it was beating louder than anything else in the room. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know where to look. She wasn't used to attention, especially not from a room full of people who usually acted as if she was invisible. The clapping continued in smaller waves, as if people couldn't help themselves. Some guests even looked at one another with amazed expressions, silently agreeing that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. A man in a neat suit stepped forward first. He wasn't loud and he didn't push anyone aside, but the calm confidence in his walk made the crowd part as he approached her. She didn't recognize him, but others did. Whispers spread quickly. That's the producer. It's a big name. He rarely reacts to anything. The waitress blinked, unsure why someone like him would be walking toward her. He stopped near the piano, keeping a respectful distance. That was incredible, he said softly. Truly. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She simply nodded, still overwhelmed by the moment. I don't know your story, he continued, but I'd like to. If you're open to it, I'd love to hear your music again somewhere outside this busy hall, the crowd murmured. Even the restaurant staff exchanged shocked looks. The waitress felt her chest tighten with a mix of disbelief and fear. She didn't want to embarrass herself by saying something foolish, so she just whispered, "Thank you." Before she could say anything more, several other guests approached. One woman, dressed in a gown that shimmered under the lights, held her hands together as if she had witnessed something sacred. You moved the whole room, she said gently. Your music. It felt like a story. Thank you for sharing it, another man, someone who earlier had seemed bored and uninterested in the entire event, stepped forward. That was the most honest performance I've heard in years, he said. Do you perform anywhere? The waitress almost laughed, but not out of rudeness. It was the strange kind of unexpected humor that came when life surprised someone too much for them to process. No, I don't perform, she whispered. A few people looked surprised. One person even said, how is that possible? She didn't know how to explain it. She didn't know how to tell these people that she had been playing in private for most of her life, that she had never believed her music was good enough to share. Instead, she said softly, I used to play a little when I was younger. The producer nodded slowly, as if everything was starting to make sense. Sometimes, he said, talent grows in quiet places. The restaurant owner finally stepped forward. He looked stunned, maybe even a little embarrassed. He glanced at her apron, then at the piano, then at the guests around her. I had no idea, he said quietly. She didn't expect an apology, but his eyes softened in a way she had never seen before. You did something tonight that none of us saw coming, he added, and I'm proud of you. Those words surprised her more than anything else. She nodded politely, but didn't know what to say. The room slowly returned to its usual gentle background noise. Servers began clearing dishes again, but many of them walked over to her first, offering smiles and quiet congratulations. They weren't jealous or bitter. They were genuinely happy for her. Girl, you just made history in here. One of the cooks whispered with a grin. You shocked everyone, another server said proudly. Her heart warmed. These were people who had seen her on tired days, on stressful days, on days when she tried her best to smile, even though life felt heavy. Their support meant more to her than the applause from strangers. When the crowd finally returned to their seats, the producer stepped aside, giving her space. I'll be leaving soon, he said. But if you'd like to talk or just explore possibilities, here's my card.
Oh.
He placed it gently on the piano. She stared at it. The card looked simple, but it felt heavier than anything she had ever held in her hands. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a doorway. After the guests settled, the restaurant owner approached her again. If you want, he said, you can take the rest of the night off. You've done more than enough. She shook her head softly. No. I'll finish my shift. He stared at her for a moment, then smiled. Of course you will. She placed the towel on her arm again and walked slowly back toward the kitchen. People watched her with newfound respect. Some whispered kind words as she passed. Others simply smiled, even while clearing tables. She felt different, lighter, stronger, as if she had reclaimed a part of herself she didn't know was still alive at the end of the night. After the last guest left and the staff began wiping down the final tables, she returned to the grand piano. The hall was quiet now, filled only with the soft hum of lights and the distant sounds of cleaning. She sat on the bench one more time, just to touch the keys gently, not to play, just to feel them. A janitor sweeping the floor nearby said, You know, they'll be talking about you for a long time. She gave a small smile. I still can't believe it happened, he chuckled. Believe it. I was here. And trust me, people don't clap like that unless they mean it. She nodded. Feeling warmth in her chest, when she finally changed out of her uniform and stepped outside into the cool night air, she felt like the city itself looked different. Lights seemed brighter. The breeze felt softer. Even the quiet street felt full of possibility. She held the producer's card in her hand. She looked at the name, the number, the simple logo. She didn't know if she would call. She didn't know if she was ready. But she did know something had changed inside her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel like a person, trapped in routines. She felt seen. She closed her eyes for a moment and breathed in deeply, the night air filling her lungs. When she opened them, she whispered to herself, "Maybe this is just the beginning." She started walking down the quiet street, the card still in her hand, her steps steady and calm. Behind her, the restaurant stood silent, as if still holding the echo of the final note she played. And ahead of her, the world stretched wide and open, filled with possibilities she had never imagined. Her life wasn't the same anymore, and she could finally feel it. Asterisk.